All right. All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get set with this next panel, the last panel before lunch. So we'll try to make this quick and painless, but we will have an opportunity for some audience participation, ask some questions as we get towards the end. So good morning, I'm Sam Gray. I am one of the board members of the Silicon Valley Defense Group, a nonprofit that's designed to connect the people, the capital, and the technology that will advance this new and emerging defense technology sector. So today I'm joined by two people to have a really interesting conversation around venture capital and how we bring in sort of the venture-backed ecosystem into the Defense Department. So we're going to start with Dr. Nick Estep, who's an active duty lieutenant colonel with the Air Force. He is the director of the Emerging Technologies Portfolio at the Defense Innovation Unit. And I'll let him kick it off, and then we have a short video presentation from his director.
All right, good morning, everyone. Is this good? Okay, there we go. So I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Estep. I'm from the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. I run our emerging tech portfolio. I'm honored to be a representative here at the Northeast Indiana Defense Summit. I want to thank Congressman Banks and his team for the invitation to participate. Our director, Doug Beck from DIU, he sends his regrets as he wasn't able to attend, but he did send some short comments that we were going to play for the forum.
Hi, everyone. It is an honor to join you virtually at the 3rd Annual Northeast Indiana Defense Summit. I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you today, but I'm really proud to be able to be here virtually, and I'm really glad that a few members of our team from DIU can be there with you live. We're here today with a common strategic mission: to highlight and enhance the region's role in national security and innovation. This is a critical moment for commercial and dual-use technology as we witness its transformative impact across all technology areas and across defense and national security. And this summit is not just a forum. What you have brought together represents a dynamic convergence of policymakers, industry leaders, and community champions who share a vision for advancing defense tech while fostering the industrial base and helping us build deeper capability in the areas we need right here in the United States and right with you in Indiana. I also want to step back and thank Congressman Banks for inviting me and our DIU team to be a part of this gathering of Northeast Indiana's vital defense sector. Congressman, your visionary efforts to establish Indiana as a key player in the defense industry are critical. Your commitment to integrating cutting-edge commercial tech into our national defense strategy is both far-reaching and central. Because of your leadership, Indiana is poised to attract and sustain a diverse community of strategic defense tech founders and funders, and we at the department deeply appreciate your dedication, look forward to teaming up with you and with the team that you're helping build to tackle our most critical national security needs together. This forum represents a key step in that effort, a powerful opportunity to forge new partnerships, exchange groundbreaking ideas, and drive forward the strategic initiatives that will shape the future of Northeast Indiana, our nation, and the world. So, stepping back to the next day or two, the time that you're together, I encourage all of you to make the very most of that time. The dual fluency talent that's gathered as part of this forum is crucial for fostering the kind of interchange we need to elevate this area of capability to the next level. So with that in mind, I would just ask that you use this time to do just a few things. One, please push yourselves and keep pushing yourselves. Do what you do and do best to keep pushing the bounds of technology and what we can do together with it. Keep pushing each other, because that partnership and competition is at the heart of what makes all of us better. And critically, please keep pushing us. We need your help. We need your ideas, your urgency, your talent, and your partnership to tell us what else we need to be doing to have an impact on your behalf and where there are systemic barriers to your ability to make a difference in the ways that we need you to, that we can help knock down so that you can do that. Remember, the energy and ideas that come out of today are not meant to stay confined within these walls. Let's take them out into the world, let's spark conversations, and let's drive real change, real impact, ultimately for the warfighter. Again, thank you for being a part of this journey with us, and here's to making waves and shaping a better tomorrow together. Thank you.
All right. Nick, anything you want to add on DIU before we introduce Delian and how they leverage you guys?
Sure. So I think there's been some great talks this morning setting the scene. I say first, the imperative is pretty clear. It's a complex, dynamic world out where there's multiple conflict zones that are simultaneously engaged in. There's strategic adversaries that don't share our values. So that's setting a scene. If you look at it from the side perspective from defense acquisition, that very little has changed in the last 60 years. It's mostly based on the McNamara era, where things were very slow from a threat perspective, systems were less complex, and just the defense industry at that time had a lot more influence in terms of the adoption and just the maturation of technology. If you come to fast forward to modern day eras, it's not simply is not the same. There's just a dynamic, rapid change and pace from a technology perspective, from autonomy to AI to cyber, and you just continue down the list. These are now industries that are being driven from the private sector, from the dual use commercial sector, that the Defense Department itself is not the driving force that's imposing that particular change. And so that is the impetus from our perspective, that if we are going to continue to provide strategic capability that addresses these national security needs, then we need to be able to adopt at large scale commercial and dual use technology. And that's effectively the mantra from the Defense Innovation Unit. 5 years ago when we first started, it was more about establishing contacts with the non-traditional, with the commercial industry, with the Defense Department. In some cases that was just simply engaging in meetings. That was the success criteria. Hey, Defense Department, this is Silicon Valley, this is the Defense Department. It's nice to meet you. If you continue the next couple of years, we started to establish what is the process that we can engage that's not the traditional defense acquisition mold, that we can start to harness and leverage some of this dual-use commercial technology that's available, that can address strategic needs within the Defense Department. And that was kind of our 2.0 mold. And now if you fast forward to when Doug Beck became our director, he calls it the 3.0, and that's basically taking the process that we've established and consolidating into actually addressing real-world strategic needs from the Defense Department, from the combatant commanders. How can we actually adjust and impact plans of our competitors and adversaries out there? Can we bring to bear what we've done at scale and speed and be able to provide a capability that the Defense Department, that the traditional defense acquisition process is not being able to provide currently. So I'll say it's more of an adoption rather than a technology perspective from what I've seen. There's a lot of great universities and academia and companies out there are developing technology. It's more about adoption and how we remove the barriers of entry and how we can scale that particular adoption. So that's the mantra and the focus area from DIU is to be able to bring those dual use commercial technologies to be able to address strategic needs from the joint force.
All right, perfect. So thank you for that introduction and really what DIU is and how it's being leveraged. Let's talk about an actual practitioner. So Delian, you're the co-founder of Varda. I'll give you a chance to explain what a hypersonics pharmaceutical company is, because it probably needs some explanation. You're also a partner at Founders Fund, one of the most prolific VCs in the dual-use defense space. So talk about both those roles, and then what is Varda and how does it fit into this whole ecosystem?
Yeah, maybe start off with the more complicated part, which is what is a hypersonic pharmaceutical company? Sounds a little crazy. I've been obsessed with the idea of sort of in-space manufacturing since I was a kid. I always saw it as the way that ultimately you made, sort of humanity truly multiplanetary. You had to have these industrial use cases that justified having a human up there, rather than just state budgets paying for humans being up there. And so if you can make space feel like a, let's say, oil rig job where it's 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, but you're out there because you're contributing significant economic value to the rest of the capital, sort of markets and economic markets, you'll eventually not just have one human on a quote-unquote oil rig up in space, but 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and eventually you'll get to an industrial park that's the size of, Dallas or Fort Worth, but up in, sort of low Earth orbit. And so I originally, sort of approached this as an investment thesis. Originally did not think that this was going to have any overlap in defense. Ultimately ended up having to incubate and start the company because there was nobody that I thought was doing it quite the right way. And as a part of our business, once we're finished with the basically in-space manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, we ultimately have to bring those drugs back down here on Earth for the clinical trials that happen down here. We have to bring them back, and so we have these reentry pods that we bring back that rather than things like the Apollo capsule or the Crew Dragon or the Soyuz have no humans on board. And so we can go through a much steeper angle of attack through the atmosphere, which allows us to be more precise in our landing, which means higher G-forces, higher heat fluxes, much more stringent aerothermal, sort of chemical environment. That's what also makes it highly relevant to the department, where we now collaborate with the Air Force, the Navy, with NASA to act as a testing mechanism for next generation strategic systems and hypersonic boost glide subcomponents to allow them to gain flight heritage in that, we'll talk a bit about the Valley of Death, that Valley of Death from TRL 4 through 9, where you can get to a certain level on the ground and in wind tunnels and in modeling, but you ultimately sort of can't get all the way there. And so somewhat unexpectedly, what I thought was going to be this purely civil, sort of private company focused on in-space production of pharmaceuticals turned out to also have this, sort of massive component that, as a proud patriot, I'm thrilled to basically, sort of serve, the need of the, sort of department through our capabilities. When I think about, sort of the, second part of my, role, which is I'm a partner at Founders Fund, which is this venture capital firm founded in 2004 by Peter Thiel and several other, sort of PayPal co-founders. And the firm has had the, sort of, let's say, luck or, sort of benefit of being involved in some pretty phenomenal companies quite early on. Palantir was co-founded by Peter Thiel, as well as Joe Lonsdale, who will speak later inside of the firm. We were also the largest shareholder of SpaceX for a long time, still are. We also incubated a company in 2016 that many of you have referenced earlier, Anduril, called Adranos, and then have had the benefit to also incubate Varda within the investment firm. When I think about the sort of progression of the firm and our investment into these types of dual use significant sort of defense companies, I somehow have a sort of kitschy way of describing it, which is that if in the mid 2000s you wanted to start a defense company as an entrepreneur, you not only had to be a billionaire, so you had to be Peter Thiel or Elon Musk, but you also had to be willing to sue the U.S. Department of Defense in order to convince them to adopt your innovative technologies. So both Palantir and SpaceX had to sue the Air Force and Army, I believe, respectively, in order to get adoption of their technologies. Thankfully, they changed how the department thinks about adopting next-generation technologies from private companies. And so now in 2016, if you wanted to start an innovative defense company, you no longer had to be a billionaire and sue the government. You now just had to be a billionaire. And so good old Palmer Luckey manages to go start Anduril and have quite a bit of success. But, it was non-trivial for them as well. They faced many obstacles. And, now in some ways standing on the shoulder of giants, atop giants, I think in 2020 when I finally started Varda, I felt like I no longer had to be a billionaire suing the government. I no longer had to be a billionaire. I just had to be very good friends with several billionaires. And that was, a lowering of the barrier to entry. And one day, I hope that we lower the barriers to entry enough with groups like DIU and AFWorks and SpaceWorks so that one day, even friends of billionaires can start innovative defense tech companies.
All right, I think that'll definitely be the takeaway from today is make friends with lots of billionaires. So, well, let's talk about the value that these venture-backed companies bring to the ecosystem. The Small Business Administration, a lot of people use SBIRs. Like, I always like to tell companies when they're starting this, remember, it is the Small Business Administration, not the Startup Administration, right? Like, that is not their model. Let's talk about the difference between a startup and a small business, because while they are the same at the beginning, the goal is speed and scale, how rapidly they get to that point. The two companies you brought up that came out first, Palantir and SpaceX, both started in early 2000s, rapidly grew to be pretty massive players providing a lot of capability. Anduril started in 2016. We're now seeing valued at $14 billion, doing, several hundreds of millions of dollars, we assume, in revenue. That's not public information because they are a private company. But as we look at Anduril and the capability they're providing, the fact that they're acting more like a big now, let's talk about what venture capital brings to this ecosystem, what you two, separately look at, and how you can provide the signal to those investors so that when you're building a company like Varda, let's just start with you, Delian. Like, how does that go when you go in and you are raising capital, when you're going to both people that are investing in you because of the potential pharmaceutical market and also people that look at you as a potential provider for hypersonic capability for test?
Yes, our company in the first sort of 18 months after sort of being founded raised $144 million in our seed, Series A, and Series B rounds, and a part of that I admit was the zero interest rate sort of period. But a part of it was the fact that investors were fundamentally underwriting the fact that we did have these sort of dual use applications. On the in-space pharmaceutical side, I won't touch on that too much, but interest from top 20 pharma, reformulating their best products. Merck in 2019 on the International Space Station took one of their blockbuster drugs, Keytruda, showed they could reformulate it. This is a drug that did $26 billion in revenue for them the sort of prior year, and meant that they could get an additional 7 years of patent extension and also transfer it to, rather than patients having to come into an IV clinic, instead a syringe they could take in the comfort and safety of their own home. On the defense side, why were sort of investors fundamentally sort of excited, and why does it end up sort of being a sort of win-win? They clearly saw that what we had sort of tapped into was not, sorry, that's my co-founder. He's the only person that's allowed to make noise, and I'll put it on airplane mode. It was my co-founder. They clearly saw that what we were serving was not just something that was a temporary use case for small business, but ultimately was going to sort of be a true sort of operational need for the department. And maybe to sort of back up and sort of give a bit of sort of history. If you look at the world of sort of hypersonics, things that operate in the regime of sort of Mach 12, sort of 13 and above. Historically, obviously, you had the ICBM programs that followed these purely sort of ballistic trajectories, and then it was always theorized that we would start to sort of work on things that actually had sort of navigational gliding sort of capabilities in that regime. But it was always seen as somewhat of a fairy tale. Plenty of people, Dr. sort of Lewis and many people at Purdue did lots of sort of modeling, theoretical analysis, materials. But ultimately, in order to actually understand that realistic environment, you have to ground it in actual sort of flight testing. DARPA in sort of 2014 sort of famously took on a program to attempt to create that type of boost glide vehicle across 2 separate vehicles. $400 million in total program. Ended up losing these vehicles. They broke apart immediately as they entered into the Mach regime and entered into the atmosphere and tried to glide around. And so, in 2018, at the time, it's still thought of as this far off, sort of fairy tale. The idea that boost glide hypersonics were going to become an operational warfighter capability seemed highly unlikely. A small group within, sort of AFRL in Albuquerque decided to start to think about how could we at least create a low-cost testing mechanism, and so began work on a program for an in-house, basically satellite and reentry capsule system, because they started to see that there was this large private company, SpaceX, that had built these very interesting reusable rockets, and those reusable rockets were now making it so that you could send something up to Mach 25, which happens to be the orbital velocity around Earth determined by the mass of the Earth, but that instead of having to pay for a dedicated sounding rocket, you could instead pay $2 to $3 million to get 300, 400 kilos of a product up there, and then as long as you had some propulsion on board that brought you back through a ballistic trajectory, that if you kind of squinted at it, the combination of the Falcon 9, basically reusable rocket, as well as the propulsion system, give you the equivalent of a sounding rocket, but now for $3 million bucks a pop. At the time, they tried to RFP, send it out to a bunch of the primes. None of the primes were particularly interested because at the time it was still seen as this far off fairy tale that people would actually need regular Mach testing in the Mach 13, 14, 15 regime. They decided to sort of in-house sort of build the sort of program. And in 2021, 2 things by fluke of history happened to happen in the exact same time frame. In July of 2021, the Chinese demonstrated an operational boost glide hypersonic missile. It's still somewhat unknown, the exact targeting capabilities. Maybe there are people in this room that know more than I do. But in terms of exact targeting capabilities, the costs, what it can do, not perfectly known. But in theory, I think about this a lot from the end warfighter need. Earlier this year, I got to tour the USS Eisenhower as it was out in Miami for Miami Fleet Week, which is where I'm based. And so phenomenal sort of asset, amazing sailors on board, great projection of sort of force, fighter jet pilots like you on board, able to perform some phenomenal capabilities, but ultimately in some ways vulnerable to capability like what the Chinese demonstrated, in that you now have a vehicle that costs on the order of $100 to $200 million. Because you get to start in the vacuum environment of space, you can go very, very fast in a way that a surface-to-air defense system that starts in the very thick soup of the atmosphere that we have down here on Earth has a much harder time getting up to those speeds. And so you've got a $100 to $200 million vehicle that now can take out a $13 billion aircraft carrier. Economic warfare and human life loss that the United States Defense Department is not going to be willing to bear, let's say, in the defense of Taiwan. And so that happens in July 2021, and Mark Milley and others sort of raise the alarm bells. And also Varda starts and happens to be working on the exact same satellite and capsule system that what the department was thinking of was going to be the best sort of framework and architecture for this type of sort of low-cost testing. And so we started to engage with sort of groups in the Air Force and Navy, and now are executing on over $100 million of programs between sort of military and civil, to basically on a regular basis, including later this year, test next generation strat systems and boost glide subcomponents. Think of these as the flight controls, the navigation sensors, the spectrometers to be able to detect the adversarial, ICBMs, while in tandem also manufacturing pharmaceuticals for top 20 pharma companies. And so I think, in some ways we've gotten to stand on the shoulders of giants in that, people, have talked about the valley of death at length in relation to, startups contracting with the Defense Department. I'd like to say in some ways we're proof in the pudding that, again, you had to be friends with a billionaire, but we were able to cross that, sort of valley of death. And we were able to do it in a way that was truly dual use in this upcoming November flight. We will both be testing, sort of payloads on behalf of the United States Air Force, as well as manufacturing pharmaceutical products for a top 20 pharmaceutical company. And so I think that's, where private capital marries well with the Defense Department, in that our early contract that really unlocked us was within AFWorks, the Strat5 program, where explicitly, as a part of the $30 million that the Defense Department is bringing, you need to match that with $30 million of private capital, which we were able to do because the private capital saw the potential for, as our previous speaker was saying, profits and growth that they were ultimately, sort of underwriting, not only in our defense use case, but also in our pharmaceutical use case.
I think that's a great hypothetical example of compare and contrast traditional defense acquisition. Because if you go to a service or wherever else, and they're going to spend 5 years kind of doing analysis of returns, it's unlikely they're going to come up with a space-based manufacturing capability, right? So, but hey, if there is a company out there that has dual use, that has private backing, that has something that appears of value, maybe the hypothesis is how could we use it? What's the end customer? Who could leverage it for some capacity or capability? This is exactly what the question you need to ask and how we actually operate at DIU. That's effectively our mantra. But instead of going out and specifying a specific specification document for an RFP, that's going to be 1,000 pages long. That was a very triggering moment when I heard it earlier this morning. But it's more about an end-use state. What is the challenges we face? Can you detail what you think the end-use case or the environment that it might be applied to? This goes back to your question of how you get to scale and actually adoption. It's very end-state oriented. What could you leverage it for to address a critical mission need? It's not about developing a technology that is along the way. There's other pathways, there's other means to do that. That's all very important, but really thinking about the end state of its utility from the mission perspective. So in this case, it would be something along the lines of, can you provide some hypersonic or some capability, test capability? We're not going to identify or determine and be very prescriptive on the technology or the approach. Tell us how we can leverage the capability that you're developing as an industry to address a need. And so this was effectively how we would operate. We would, put out a call industry in a very commercial to commercial-like fashion. Most of our submissions are completely open and posted on our website. We will articulate the end constraints or the challenges that we face. We might even describe how we envision to leverage it from the defense community. We would bring our potential stakeholders in from the very beginning so we can help to evaluate its utility. And then, that's effectively, our mission need or our requirement. And so companies would come in, they would actually pitch it. It is as simple as either a 5-page white paper or a 15-slide submission. That's actually our phase 1 submission. So the path of impedance to working with non-traditionals to a larger ecosystem, it's a very low burden of entry in order to say, hey, we think we have something that is value added. Maybe it's a subset of your need, or maybe it's a compelling piece of the story that we think can address the mission set that you describe. And so that's effectively how we start to evaluate and to assess different companies that might be able to address a mission like the hypersonics one that you just described. Back to the question of how do you work with these companies, like from the Defense Department? When we work with them, we actually ask them about their commercial strategy. What I don't want to hear when I go in and start talking with a company that has private backing, I don't want to hear how it's going to be completely orthogonal to their vision as a business entity, saying, here, we're doing these things. We think there's a derivative of what we're doing that's beneficial to DoD. And I don't want them to tell us that we're going to peel off dramatically from what we're doing. Otherwise, the ROI for this process and approach kind of starts to reduce, and it's not nearly the same in terms of the compelling nature or the benefit. So we actually want to hear about their commercial strategy, how this is very consistent with where they're going as a business entity and a venture, how we can effectively go from a hypothesis perspective and test and qualify its utility to address a DoD mission need, and what that means afterward. Because when it comes down to it, that's really what's important is you do something useful, you establish utility in some respect. What does it mean? Can you go use it? Can you go leverage it? How are you going to access in a sustainment perspective? And that's how you start to send those signals to saying, hey, yes, the DoD is open to more a broad ecosystem to other companies in terms of opportunity from a dual use or revenue perspective. And that's the process you need to do and show some success criteria in order to start sending that message that, yes, it actually means that way. We don't have to do everything in a 12 to 15-year design cycle. Some things maybe need to do that, but if there is a dual use or private backing that's being leveraged in some capacity, the more it fits the mantra of show us what you have, let's go and evaluate its utility from different stakeholders and coalition of partners in the DoD perspective, show how it's useful, how we can use it, and then go and apply it as such. Then you start to making those marks and start setting the signals appropriately to the founders and the funders out there.
I think it's also, there's an important responsibility on sort of both sides of the equation. On the department side, to not be overly prescriptive on here's how you should be developing your technology, but instead analyzing the sort of private markets. In some ways, if you look at some of the best national security advantages that the United States has, a decent number of them come from the private markets. Reusable rockets developed by the private markets. The fact that we're at the forefront of AI is entirely sort of due to the private markets. But I think there's also an onus on the companies as well, in that you should not be developing technology just for technology's sake, which I do see a lot of companies sort of fall into this trap where they get early traction with an innovative group like DIU or an AFWorks or SpaceWorks. They get that early use, but they never end up, sort of closing out and, linking to the end warfighter need. And so, in relation to how we think about this at Varda all the time is we are not just testing in hypersonics for testing's sake and, sending, toys up there. We want to make sure that these ultimately end up getting integrated into the end operational Minuteman, Trident, conventional prompt strike, next generation boost glides. Because if we're not closing that loop of, Sandia Labs, creates a next generation spectrometer that gets tested on Varda and gets advanced to TRL-7, if that spectrometer never makes its way into an operational vehicle, what was the point of the entire basically sort of development campaign? And so I think there's also onus on the private companies to not just purely be technology providers, but also act as a partner to their end defense colleagues and understand how do you eventually close sort of the loop. And so we've actually found that a lot of value that groups within the Defense Department find in Varda is not just the sort of servicing technology that we provide, but we actually help guide some of these payload providers through how do you get sort of rated and ready to eventually go through the hypersonic flight regime in a way that improves that payload's capabilities for when it actually does get integrated into Sentinel, into Trident.
Yeah, let's dig into a couple parts that you both brought up here of really how do you get that signal out. As a venture investor, one of the ways that we gain conviction with the group that I'm with at Franklin Templeton is really talking to customers, right? If a company comes in and they said, hey, we have all this traction, this is our growth profile, we're basically underwriting that growth. We need to actually believe that they are going to get this hockey stick growth profile, that they're going to be worth 10 times, 20 times the value of their current revenue. In order to do that on the commercial side, it's very easy. We go talk to customers, and customers are generally very open. I'd love to hear your opinion because I bet pharmaceuticals are probably a little different about how open they are. But for the most part, we can go talk to those customers. When we talk to a defense startup, that changes drastically. So we generally leverage groups like the ones you were talking about, sort of the more forward-leaning, innovative groups, but that's not where the money is. Right. So Nick, talk to us a little bit about how you bridge that gap, because that's where you get out of like true startup land and you get into the growth model where you're providing real capability.
Yeah, I would say the Defense Department is a tough customer across the board. Sometimes we don't know what we want. I would also agree we don't do software very well. You might find that every equities of an organization might be different. Maybe there's a technology developed at a commercial company, but it doesn't ideally fit within the constraints of a single entity, and maybe the program office is different than that entity. And so, there's several levers that have to go right for you to probably be successful from an adoption standpoint. I know I'm talking about the technology, but just from adoption standpoint. So there's lots of ways that these things can fail. And so part of what we're trying to do, at least the process we do, is try to get to that end state without having to hit those normal barriers in terms of being able to show utility, assessing the potential stakeholders and customers from the defense side, vetting the commercial perspective to see if we think that there's notable or viable technology to potentially address a mission set. And that doesn't mean find a widget, everyone go bid on a widget. We say, okay, we think that there's a viable, mature commercial sector out there that can do this mission set. Maybe it's not the same thing that you're thinking. And it's also working with those stakeholders. There's probably a number of different coalition of partners on the Defense Department's perspective, kind of shepherding them along through the process. All that is done in curation. I don't think we would go out and start a solicitation and start to send those messages until we've done our diligence from the beginning. So we want to make sure that we have compelling story, we have a mission set we think is a high strategic need, we have the right defense stakeholders that we think could be an end customer. Maybe it's not a clean trace line from start to finish, but we have done our diligence to find those and make sure that they're involved from the beginning. We've assessed the commercial perspective. We think about the process to which we want to execute and establish viability of what we're going to do. And then in state, where could this thing go afterward that we've completed? If it's successful, great. What does that mean? Can we start to plan with the stakeholders, either from phasing a budget in the out years? Can we start to help them to illustrate or change their culture? Maybe it's a navigation warfare community that's built sensors to go in to collect RF emissions and do discrimination on those waveforms that have never done an analytic approach. Maybe you can do the same mission set by just using kind of more of a, maybe you can use anomaly detection from the forensics or from the financial sector, highly developed and mature in the commercial sector. Maybe you can apply it in order to detect navigation warfare, jamming or spoofing techniques. This is an actual example. So maybe it's a culture thing to help to shepherd them, bring them along, say, make them comfortable that you can address 80% of your mission doing it a different way without having to go through the traditional structure that you normally have. So a lot of it is culture, a lot of it is developing and formulating what you think the problem set is, making sure you have the right stakeholders from the Defense Department to start, going through that process, vetting the commercial industry, and we have a whole team that is commercially facing in order to make sure that we're up to speed with the greatest companies that are coming out from stealth mode to startups to non-traditionals, everything, and then go through that source selection progress. And we are very targeted and precise with how we work with an industry. We're very precise in that we pick a select few that we want to go through this process in order to show utility to an end state. And so, if you do that, that allows you to, reduce the number of levers that can traditionally were preclude the normal process to get to success in the end state and what would be transition. And that's effectively the process that we try to take on every solicitation, every project that we run at DIU.
Yeah, I think you talked about, as a private investor, how do you go about, underwriting, this type of, business line or, sort of use case in a dual use company where one set of customers may be very difficult to understand. And I think in some ways my counterpoint would be, maybe, revealing, some information here, but we actually recently went through a, sort of Franklin Templeton, sort of underwriting process. And I would actually argue in some ways that's actually probably easier to underwrite than most like SaaS software companies, in that the department has a publicly available budget and you can understand what the priorities are. Congressional members set the sort of priorities and what those future sort of out year budgets are going to look like. You can definitely sort of talk to those offices. And then, maybe our end department, sort of customer is somewhat anomalous, but they were actually willing to hop on the phone with private investors. Now, I think a part of why they were willing to do so is it's the same customer that was originally involved in the original StratFi program and knows that the reason that we were able to, sort of do so much with that original $60 million program was because of the matching private capital dollars. And so I think they were comfortable with this idea of private capital is going to be along for the ride. They're going to need some information about how we're, sort of thinking about this in the long term. And so your group at Franklin Templeton literally talked to the program officer that runs the program that we're involved in, sort of within the Air Force as a portion of that underwriting in conjunction with the analysis of the NDAA, understanding of the budgets, the line items that we're, applicable for. And so in some ways as an investor, when I think about, sort of defense companies that we're underwriting at Founders Fund relative to others, I actually think I find the defense companies a bit easier to underwrite than most, in that it's a more limited customer set. There's not some infinite set that I need to go after. It's very tractable in understanding exactly what the budgets are. I can go talk to the congressional offices and the chief of staff to understand how are these things trending. Is this an actual sort of end need that you've heard about on a regular basis? And then, when you walk around the, sort of shop floor, I find it a lot easier to digest, what's going on when somebody's building a, sort of Humvee, a solid rocket motor, or a spacecraft, much more so than, trying to understand, what is going on in, groups like OpenAI or Anthropic, where it seems like, they barely even understand the arcane wizardry of what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think you're both bringing up a point here that, the hardware startups, the venture-backed hardware companies so far have done much better. Palantir being a very obvious exception there, but there really isn't another sort of highly successful yet software company, say there's someone who's at hopefully one of those as we get into sort of the next wave of, venture-backed startups to go into this space. All right, we're running a little bit short on time, so I did want to open it up to questions. Think about what those questions are. Before I do, kind of what have I not asked today that you guys wanted to cover, and then we'll go to the floor for questions. And I actually don't know yet. We do have microphones floating around.
Yeah, I think the only thing that we haven't sort of touched on is also the sort of whole of government and international sort of approach that I think both the State Department and the Defense Department deserve a lot of credit for. I'll articulate sort of one very tactical example in relation to Varda. We originally landed our first mission in the Air Force's Utah Test and Training Range, which was an exciting initial endeavor. It took us a little longer than expected to get that done, but fundamentally is because that range's commander, his sort of core mission is test weapons and train fighters. And a space capsule filled with drugs from space doesn't neatly fit into either one of those, very cleanly. And so it was difficult to, get high up on the, sort of priority, sort of list, there. And so in our future missions, while SecDef is working on prioritizing a Western range for landing of commercial space capsules, we are going to be landing in the Kaniba Test and Training Range out in Australia. And only possible due to some of the AUKUS sort of framework that the State Department set up, the fact that the Defense Department is comfortable with sort of hypersonic technologies sort of being tested there. And so I think as we sort of think about sort of countering Taiwan, countering sort of Russia, it is very much so this whole of government approach. And I think some of the things that we do in these innovative departments and private companies sort of can support that international whole of government approach.
Maybe just two more comments for me. I think one, a point of emphasis, if it is a dual-use commercial tech, that's also likely the least burdensome if you want to share with partners or allies. Most of this is unclassified. It's a very useful lever from a instruments of power perspective in terms of what you can share, what you can provide in order to shape and influence around the globe. And then two, I'd say I've seen progress, at least in my 16, 17-year career, in terms of seeing the government across the different agencies I've supported in the Defense Department in terms of starting to think differently, starting to change their culture in order to be able to address these different methodologies and techniques to be able to move much faster. So I've seen it from the IC, I've seen it from the Defense Department. We see a coalition of these defense innovation ecosystems start to come together and coordinate better. So I've seen pretty strong progress from the defense side in the last several years, and hopefully we continue to see that and to shape and to be able to grow our national security innovation base that we're going to need.
All right, I think we have time for a couple of questions. So just raise your hand. Anybody who has a question, we'll get a microphone to you. There's one in back.
Hey, thanks for coming out. What is your opinion on the DoD's efforts and support of quantum communications and all of those good things? And I know you'll probably be able to explain it all in 2 minutes here. So.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Very easy topic.
So I'll start with the DoD in general, from the quantum information science, which is a larger aperture. I own our quantum portfolio at DIU. It's pretty well coordinated across the different services, the S&T community, as well as the IC. So there's a pretty good sharing and interaction. I'll start with that. So, and Dr. John Burke is the PDD for quantum at the Pentagon. And so, there's a larger bubble in terms of the different technologies that are kind of coming out. I think quantum is a very interesting one because there is a lot of private backed companies and ventures that's driving it, from quantum communication for encryption purposes, from quantum sensing to quantum computing. There's a lot of money that's going in from the private side, and the DoD in some cases have a pretty good idea in terms of an application usage or like where we can leverage it. In some cases, it's much more nebulous. And so I would say quantum communication and quantum networking is probably more on the assessment and early assessing of kind of how we can apply them. Other technologies, I think we have a much clearer use case in terms of direct translation of how the DoD specifically would address near-term strategic needs. And so I'll say quantum sensing for the purpose of the position, navigation, and timing. That's a big focus area for me right now, because there's specific use cases that either have classical phenomenology that are addressing strategic missions, and we have, so we know exactly if there's a quantum or an atomic variant of those particular sensors and phenomenologies. We know exactly how we can use them. We know exactly if it will increase the mission effectiveness of the strategic joint force or if it introduces new opportunities for us. So I'll say that's probably the nearest term spectrum in terms of like near term, specific, concrete application from the Defense Department. I'll say quantum communication, quantum networking, and the companies that are kind of within that ecosystem would be kind of the next phase. And I know there's various applications across the community of DoD that are starting to assess, get more comfortable with it. A lot of it is actually building familiarity from a workforce perspective and understanding, can spell the word quantum within the DoD. So it's just an unfamiliar place that, for one, we don't want to have strategic surprise. So I'll say that is just, I would say, the next tranche in terms of near-term, much stronger concrete utility within the Defense Department in terms of how we would leverage the technology. I think the quantum sensing for PNT and ISR purposes are much cleaner, and the things that come after it, I think we're still vetting and starting to understand how we can apply that within the Defense Department.
Perfect, thanks. One more question in the back.
My question's also about quantum. So in regards to mainstream technologies that you see coming down the pipe, obviously you have the quantum readiness bill that's giving an additional $7 billion of funding to that specific sector. We see a lot called for within the cybernetic ecosystem for post-quantum cryptography, but not specifically QKD. Can you elaborate on that? And do you think DARPA will eventually help to bridge that initiative? Is it lack of research, lack of funding that's led to that? Or do you think that that's something that DITCO in general will just avoid and kind of just stick with post-quantum cryptography?
I will answer your question in two different ways. I will say that, yes, your point of DARPA, coming out, there's the quantum benchmarking initiative that's, near term. I think that's a great indicator that the Defense Department is consolidating our expertise that we have, starting to try to articulate near-term military-specific applications that quantum computing can address. Your point specifically about, encryption and how we, reduce our vulnerability to quantum computing based systems that might, emerge in the future that would put us at risk from an encryption standpoint. I think the post-quantum encryption standards are a great start. I think that is the most clear policy that's kind of been defined to date. KQD, I think, it depends on who you ask in the government. You might get several different answers. And I don't know if there's a formal posture other than kind of what NSA has put out in the recent years in terms of line of thinking within the department, but that's the closest I've seen in terms of a forward posture specifically for QKD. But your point remains that, post-quantum encryption standards that are coming out that NIST has defined, that has now published for our use to be able to certainly reduce our impact, presuming there is a quantum computing-based machine that could use it as a means to break our encryption standards now. So I wish I can give you a more clear answer in terms of the Defense Department says yes or no to it, but I don't think it's that clear. I think it's something still nascent. It's still early assessment. It's a very fast-moving industry, and so there's plenty of diligence and assessment across the Defense Department in order to articulate the right points. And I think the benchmark program that's coming out with DARPA is a great starting point to help us make sure that our S&T experts that are getting more familiar with quantum, how to problem translate to quantum machines, quantum computing, is a great place and a great indicator that we're actually taking this very seriously, for sure.
All right, well, that brings us up to time. I see lunch is ready for everybody here, so I won't stand in the way of that. But big round of applause for our two panelists here.